All right. I think a couple of people were having trouble seeing the slide. Please type in. There it is. Okay. Sounds like it just came through. Excellent. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. So today's session, as I mentioned, is the first webinar that we are hosting in this topic of gentrification and displacement. So today we've got Understanding Gentrification and Displacement, the Path to Equitable Development. Very glad to have all of you here today. So this webinar is hosted by the Urban Waters Learning Network, which is coordinated by both Groundwork USA and River Network. I am Deanna Toledo, one of the coordinators of the network, and I work with River Network. So if this is your first time attending an Urban Waters Learning Network session, we are a peer-to-peer network of people and organizations that are working on urban waterways and focusing both on the waterways and working to revitalize the communities that surround those waterways. So just by way of introduction, because I expect that to some it may seem a little bit of beyond mission for groups that are working in the urban water space to get involved in issues of gentrification and displacement. And yet many of us who are doing this work on the ground, many of you are seeing and experiencing rapid changes in the demographics of the neighborhoods where you are doing your urban waters work. And so for members of the Urban Waters Learning Network, we have been wrestling for quite a while with questions related to what extent are the efforts that we're putting in place to restore urban waterways, to clean them up, to advocate for infrastructure, whether it's green infrastructure to manage stormwater, greenways, parks, etc. Is there anything, are these efforts contributing to pressures that add to gentrification and displacement pressures? Is there anything that we can do to help ensure that the very community members that we're working to support through our efforts are also able to stay in those neighborhoods? So because these questions, we've been wrestling with them for quite a while, this year we're digging deeper into this topic of gentrification and displacement. Today's webinar is the first in a series of what we expect to be 4 or 5 webinars. So please, we'll come back to the next one and the date before we close off today. But we're also doing a lot more work through the Urban Waters Learning Network website, providing resources, blog posts, etc. So with that, I just want to thank you for joining us today and turn it over to my counterpart, Renee Mazurek, who's also a member of the Urban Waters Learning team, who's been doing a lot of this work on behalf of our team in this topic, and she'll introduce our presenters for today. Renee?
Thanks, Deanna. So our presenters for today are Paulina Lopez, Robin Schwartz, Chris Schildt, and Tony Defalco. Paulina is originally from Ecuador and now lives in Seattle, and she's the executive director for the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition Technical Advisory Group, where she builds on 20 years of experience working on civil rights, social and environmental justice, equity, education, and diversity issues, especially for recent immigrant communities. She has helped develop the City of Seattle's Equity and Environment Agenda, Health Impact Assessment, and others. Robin Schwartz is a Seattle native who joined the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition Technical Advisory Group in early 2017. Robin is very active in many community groups and particularly active in the newly formed Duwamish Valley Affordable Housing Coalition. Chris Schildt, a senior associate at PolicyLink, works to advance equitable economic development and anti-displacement policies and practices in cities around the country. She also serves on boards and commissions where she advances equitable housing and anti-displacement policies in her local community. As executive director of Verde, Tony Defalco is leading the movement to rewrite the environmental agenda in Portland to build wealth with low-income communities of color. His expertise in community economic development, environmental protection, and sustainability spans 20 years of working locally and nationally in environmental advocacy, coalition building, and policy advocacy. We're really happy to have these presenters here today. And I also want to encourage all of you who are in attendance to please ask your questions throughout the webinar. I will be monitoring those questions, and there will be time at different times throughout the webinar that we can bring up those questions and ask our presenters. With that, I think we'll turn it over to Paulina and Robin to introduce and give us a framework for this webinar.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So yeah, my name is Paulina Lopez, and I have the pleasure of working for this organization for the past 8 years, and now I'm serving on the role of as an executive director. So the role of our organization in the neighborhood of the Duwamish Valley has been very important through the years in responding to community needs. Just to put it in context a little bit, the Duwamish Valley is located just 3 miles down in the south end from downtown Seattle. It has been a community both for Georgetown and South Park, both that we mostly address are environmental justice communities. For both communities, we have been interacting since 2001, since the creation, because of the Superfund site that the Duwamish River was declared in 2001. So for both communities, as we have been growing capacity with the communities and making sure the voices are on the table, as when we're working with Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and also the local governments and jurisdictions, we have also make sure that we are addressing other community priorities as we have been asked by the community. So also, we have to mention that the Duwamish Valley for the years has been neglected by government as far as environmental policies. We have 13 years of shorter life expectancy compared to other neighborhoods in Seattle, just 5 miles away. Obviously, that has to do with a lot of the environmental injustices around. We are in the middle of the industrial site, but also highways. We are in Superfund site, and our communities are mostly people of color, immigrant, refugees coming from other countries. So one of the things that we have seen through the years is, as we are advocating for better policies and the betterment of our communities, finally, this past, I would say, 2 years, it feels like the city of Seattle has been responding to some of these community needs that we have been vocalizing through various channels. And we started to also get very worried about, once the community is going to be, revitalized and make that for improvement, we notice, and because the trend of the housing is being super high in Seattle now, we started to get super worried about, okay, but what about the people that has been impacted the most, that has been brought up to all these years, through these years, to this prioritization workshops, and to make sure that their voices are being heard? Are they going to be able to enjoy all these improvements that are being planned for the next 10 to 15 years? Some of them are already being delivered, but at the same time, we're seeing a rapid growth in the displacement percentage. So our community coalition, as our organization, our mission was not to address, obviously, housing, but we could not be blind about the issue. And so we have been starting to support a local effort that has been community driven. And so we had to look for some local funding and started to support it through staff. So we have 2 staff members now supporting weekly meetings, and Robin is going to be talking more a little bit in a few minutes about that. I just wanted to wrap it up by saying, as the importance that it is right now as we are moving forward and looking for best policies and jurisdictions to address the betterment of the community. I think it's super important to continue checking in with communities and where they're at, because communities priorities change with the time, and making sure that it still makes sense. Also making sure that there is a system of accountability for the governments that they're embarking of community improvements, creating policies that are going to be addressing exactly what the communities are. So I'm going to pass it on to Robin to talk a little bit more in detail of the local efforts that we'll be supporting.
Thanks, Paulina. My name's Robin Schwartz. I live in South Park. I've been here for about 12 years, so I'm actually, one of the gentrifiers, part of the problem, but luckily I've been able to find a seat on this coalition, and I'm so here, I'm representing DRCC, also as a community member though, and so what we've been working on for the last 2 years, or almost 2 years, is just kind of forming this coalition from the ground up. I'm working with a colleague from DRCC and about 5 or 6 other community members and sort of grassroots community leaders, and we've just been, trying to figure out what it means to make a coalition, what model we're going to use, trying to figure out what our goals are. We've been talking to as many people within the field as we can, other organizers in the city, people who are doing similar work, nonprofit developers. We've been trying to establish partnerships with the city and a little bit with the county, because both the city and the county and most everybody around here has a lot of strong opinions in favor of anti-displacement actions, and we're trying to sort of channel them into real policy and real actions. Let's see, after about 1.5 years, we've been meeting almost weekly, as Paulina said. After about 1.5 years, we came up with sort of 2 plans. One is sort of short-term or emergency plan, and one is more long-term. And I won't go into too much detail, but this neighborhood, South Park in Seattle, was just upzoned, which means it's really ripe for development. Right along our main corridor where most of our naturally occurring low-income housing is. So our short-term / emergency plan is to find investors so that we can hopefully purchase apartment buildings as they go on sale and just stabilize them so they won't be developed and flipped. That's all going to start happening really soon. The buildings going for sale, we don't actually have money right this second, so that's still in the works. And then our long-term plan is to find a sizable piece of property in South Park and build a mixed-use building. So retail on the bottom floor with space for community needs such as childcare, meeting space, place for youth to meet, maybe a community kitchen, and then on the floors above, affordable housing. And there are several details that are really important to us. We want them to be affordable, as per people's actual salaries, not as 80% of the AIM in Seattle, because that's really high. We also need them to be bigger than 1 or 2 bedrooms. A lot of our families have, more than 1 or 2 children, and we're also working or trying to work towards policies like right to return, trying to keep track of people who are being displaced right now or have been displaced in the last 5 years or so. So that's where we're at right now, looking for partners and looking to put our plans into action. Thanks.
So just to wrap it up a little bit on the Duwamish, it's also it's important to mention that we have been asking the city and now as well the Port of Seattle, and we have been having conversations with in county, so the different jurisdictions, government jurisdictions, and how important it is to think creatively at this point, and also making sure that they are now planning on delivering certain things without interconnecting the rest of the other asks from the community. So you cannot just be thinking about, for instance, public transportation without thinking about affordable housing. You cannot be thinking about, delivering better on the food access if we're not thinking on affordable housing or economic development. How can we create more opportunities? So I think it's a good time for governments, and this is kind of has been our role as part of our work in the RCC, the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition. How are we talking to governments, to elected officials, and It is time for action, but it's time for also being creative, talking to each other, and delivering on the promised things, being conscious of the communities, keeping them in place and making them thrive in the place where they exist and where they belong. So we're going to stop right there. And I think, sorry, we passed a little bit of our time.
Oh, that's fine. Thank you. As we transition to the next speaker, there is one question. What is the right to return?
I am not sure exactly the technical answer, but it's something we've been talking about, and it's when you are able to establish, write in policy for your and with your developer that where you keep track of who leaves the neighborhood and somehow they get first dibs, or the outreach to them first once you start passing out applications for the building.
For instance, we have like a local effort possible. There is a local nonprofit that is planning to build some affordable housing. So we have been asking if they could write in the policy the right to return, like giving preference to those people who have left the zip code 90108, which is our zip code, and if they will be priority, so they have the right to return and be part of the community where they left. So that's kind of like we're working on the policy that will support this effort.
Great. We should have Chris. I think your PowerPoint slide is up. So if you want to go ahead and get us started.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Deanna. And thank you, Paulina and Robin. I think that what you all laid out of what you're experiencing in the Duwamish River Valley in Seattle is such an experience that we're hearing communities across the country are facing. And so I really appreciate you sharing that experience and also all the work that you all are doing. And it ties in a lot to what I'm going to talk about. So when Deanna and the Urban Rivers Learning Network reached out to me, they just gave me a couple of easy questions of what are the drivers behind displacement, what are some policies or practices to address displacement, and about 15 minutes to try to lay it all out. So I apologize that I won't be able to go as in depth as I would like to, but hopefully in the Q&A we can explore some of these things more. I'm just going to try to give kind of a high-level overview of some of the drivers and the strategies. So again, thank you. My name is Chris Schiltz. I am a senior associate at PolicyLink. For those of you not familiar with PolicyLink, we are a national organization that works in communities around the country to advance economic and racial equity. My work in particular, one of my projects is called the All In Cities Anti-Displacement Policy Network. And that is a project working in 10 places around the country here to advance anti-displacement strategies. And we've been working for the past year with teams that include local elected officials, city council members and mayors, senior city staff, heads of planning departments, housing, economic development, as well as community leaders, and particularly from organizations with leadership impacted by displacement, and really wanting to center those voices of those most impacted by displacement being a part of these teams that are defining the challenges and advancing strategies. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about what we've been doing as a network, but instead kind of pull out some themes that have emerged from this work across all of the cities, and hopefully some lessons and observations of what you all as urban waters practitioners might be able to do in your communities. So first, we oftentimes get this question of talking about displacement versus gentrification. And while they are both important challenges that various communities face, we're very intentional in centering and talking about displacement. And part of why is this quote that I have up here from Manuel Pastor at the University of Southern California, which to me really defines what displacement is about. And that is that displacement is about power. Power over the market, over policy, over the meaning of place. Displacement is the erasure of cultural meaning. And really, to me, displacement in these questions is really about whether you have the choice to stay in your community. So when we talk about displacement, first, sometimes there's communities that are experiencing displacement that aren't necessarily experiencing gentrification. That might be families are getting evicted or being forced to leave their homes without a different demographic moving into the neighborhood. And there can be other causes of that. I'll touch on some of those briefly. But also, again, it's really important for us that we're centering those impacted by displacement. And so using a displacement frame really centers those communities rather than talking about gentrification and gentrifiers. Because this is, to us, is really about the policies, the systems, the structures that is driving these changes in community and what we can do about them. So I'll say displacement is not a new phenomenon. It's been happening since European colonialists landed on this continent, and the displacement and genocide and dispossession of indigenous lands through to our federal government's policies of redlining, of urban renewal, the Federal Highways Act, and so forth, on to current day practices of discrimination and racial targeting in foreclosures, speculation in the housing market. But I will say, while it's not a new phenomenon, the pressures that and some of the drivers of displacement have been growing. So since 2000, we've seen an increase in the number of renters in our 100 largest cities. Today, our half of the population in our 100 largest cities is renters, an increase of 27% since 2000. And also, we've seen an increase in housing cost burden of renters. Today, 51% of renters nationwide are burdened by paying more on housing than they should, according to HUD federal guidelines, which is 30% of your income. And that number has been increasing. There's been a 57% increase in cost burden households. So part of that is rents have been going up, and also median incomes have been declining when adjusted for inflation. And these are also challenges that are not race neutral, as we know. People of color are impacted the hardest, and particularly women of color. And I'll say it doesn't show on this chart here. You can see the breakdown of cost burden by race and by gender. But if we break that down even further, about 2/3 of African American led households are housing cost burden today. And again, these have all been increasing since 2000. So while there's a long, deep history and historical roots of what's causing displacement today, it is accelerating, and the pressures that our communities are facing are very much increasing compared to where they were just 5, 10, 15 years ago. So what are some of the drivers of displacement? We kind of can break them down into these 4 broad categories. I'll just go through this pretty quickly. One is we talk about direct displacement, when somebody is forced to leave their home by no choice of their own. That can be eminent domain or urban renewal, a big federal project comes in, or a freeway. Also evictions and foreclosures and code violations can force somebody to leave their home. And likewise, things like incarceration that remove people from communities and from their homes. We also talk about economic displacement, and this looks more at the question of who can afford to live here. So that has to do with when rents rise because investments have been coming into the community, either public investments, improvements in parks and riverfronts, such as some of the work that you all have been doing, seeing that now that's increasing private sector interest in the community. More people are wanting to buy homes who have economic means, or more investors are coming in buying up apartment buildings, like Robin was mentioning. So those sorts of investments can come in and cause increased pressure on rents and on home values that might drive folks out. But also, as there's natural, people need to move for other reasons, but could somebody with the same income as someone who currently lives into the neighborhood, could they afford to move in? Or are rents rising so much that the new people moving in kind of have to have a higher income in order to afford to live there? Well, there's also cultural displacement, which is looking at the question of who belongs in a community. And this gets at, as new population moves in, if they're of a different socioeconomic class, a different demographic, what does that mean in terms of the neighborhood, the community, kind of social fabric? cultural and religious institutions and events in the community? Are they still reflective of those who've lived there? And do the local businesses that have traditionally provided goods and services, are they still able to stay in business? And then finally, a fourth category that I think we can talk about and is relevant for the work that you all do would be climate-related displacement. Who is at risk from climate events, and are the neighborhoods that people have lived in and have called home, are they still going to be habitable moving forward? And who is most at risk of being forced to leave because of extreme weather events, or just their neighborhood is slowly becoming less and less viable because of risk from climate-related events? Likewise, where are the infrastructure investments coming in to ensure that that neighborhood can survive a climate event and can recover? What are the disaster response and recovery funding and policies in place to ensure that people can return and rebuild after an event? So those are big, broad categories, and there's a lot that fits under each one of them. We wanted to pause and take a moment here and just kind of hear from you all. I see there's a number of people who have joined us and open up a poll to you all, going through that list of direct displacement, economic displacement, cultural, and climate. Which drivers of displacement are impacting your community? So I'll turn it over to Deanna to start that poll.
So the poll is open and answers are coming in. I will say if your answer is other or you're not sure what the drivers are, if you would use the question box to provide a little additional detail to that if you're unclear. So folks are still coming in. About half of the folks in the room have voted, so I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. And right now, okay, let me give it a few more seconds. Everybody, you can respond to as many of those answers as apply to your situation. All right, so right now, Chris, it looks like 96% of the people in the room are saying economic is the biggest driver. Or is one of the drivers. About half of the folks, 48%, say it's direct, 46% cultural, and 37% climate. There's a couple of folks that are putting in other. So if you've got other details about that, please put them into the question box. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. So yeah, 96% economic, 49% direct, 47% cultural, and 36% climate.
Great. Thank you. And thank you everyone for participating in the poll. I would love to hear more from you all about more details about all of that. But I think that is also reflective of what we see around the country. As I mentioned, rents are going up, housing cost burden is going up. These economic pressures behind displacement is one of the biggest drivers that we're seeing in many, many communities around the country. So I'm going to switch now to talking a bit about some of the strategies to address displacement. And again, thank you to Paulina and Robin for mentioning some of these already. As a part of our anti-displacement policy network, we've been developing an inventory of over 60 plus policies that cities and communities can put in place in order to address different aspects of displacement. And I'm not going to have time to go through all of them now. But we will be putting that together and releasing it as a resource later this summer for other communities. So instead, what I want to do is talk about some kind of broad strategy categories or really frameworks in which to think about what kinds of anti-displacement policies are most effective in communities. And again, there's no one silver bullet, and really what it comes back down to again and again is this question of who has the power to stay in their community and shape their environment. So the first strategy that we always express as most important is to center those most impacted. Since this is a question about power in community, that those most impacted by displacement are the ones who need to be at the center of making the policy decisions, shaping the budgets, shaping how resources are going to come into their community, how it'll get distributed, and who will benefit. One example of this that I like to talk about from our network is in the Twin Cities, where they've actually brought community groups to the table to work together with city staff to shape the RFP of what should go out when putting out contracts to do planning processes for their HUD fair housing report, for example, and putting money towards actual community organizing, community engagement, not just assuming that there's folks out in the community that can volunteer their time to do that, but actually putting resources behind funding the organizations to pay organizers to do that work. The second one is to acknowledge and amend the wrongs of the past. And this is one of the things that reparations gets talked about in a number of contexts, but I think is incredibly important when we're talking about housing and is the root cause of a lot of the displacement challenges that we're facing today. So this is an example of some maps in Oakland, where I live, and in Portland, where the federal government actually went around and redlined neighborhoods based on racial characteristics and other things. And said, we will not support investments in housing in these neighborhoods. We won't support private lending. These are the HOLC maps. And while policy was passed in the 60s to end racial discrimination practices such as this, we never actually, we just moved to a supposed race-neutral framework. But when you put a race-neutral framework on a history and a legacy of racist policies coupled with today and the implicit biases and overt racial discrimination that still happens in the real estate market, we find that we don't actually have the tools to address these past wrongs. So things like the question that was asked about right to return policy is exactly the sorts of policies that we support and encourage and see as essential to advancing anti-displacement. Right to return policies, for example, the one done in Portland, acknowledges the role that the city played in urban renewal programs in an African-American neighborhood in Portland, the direct displacement and indirect displacement of African-American families that caused 2-3 generations ago, but creates a policy today saying the descendants of those folks who lived there have a right to move into the affordable housing, both rental and home ownership opportunities that are now coming into that community as new investment is coming in. So those sorts of policies that proactively give a preference to those who have been harmed in the past by our racist housing policies are incredibly important for an anti-displacement framework. The third piece is to advance housing as a human right. And what we mean by this is that somebody's ability to stay and live in their home and have a place to live should be more important than the rights of the property owner to make profit. Basically, that there should be a right to housing. And that's a big policy and legal framework that will take a long time to embed in the US. It's not how our legal system has developed in this country. But we do think that there are policies that help to advance the right of somebody having a stable, healthy, safe place to live. One of those is rent control and tenant protection policies. So this slide here shows a report that we released earlier this year called Our Homes, Our Future, How Rent Control Can Build Stable, Healthy Communities. We developed it in conjunction with the Right to the City Alliance and the Center for Popular Democracy, who are doing organizing campaigns with local affiliate organizations around the country to advance tenant protection policies and specifically rent control policies. And those provide really essential protections for low-income tenants to stay in their homes, and has been proven, the research shows again and again, that they help to stabilize communities and more effective than just about any other policy solution out there when you look at the scale, when you look at the speed of implementation, and when you look at resources, the amount of public resources that need to go into putting a policy like that in place. So this is a report that we have available on our website, ourhomesourfuture.org. Recommend you download it and read it and support rent control campaigns that are happening in states and cities around the country. And then finally, the fourth kind of policy framework for an anti-displacement framework is to build community wealth and ownership. And that's because even as we assert the notion of housing as a human right, we still need to ensure that people actually control the land and have the economic resources in order to be able to weather rent increases or price increases in their community. So 2 examples here from Buffalo. We have Push Buffalo has a green development zone on the west side of the community, which has been active in acquiring properties, turning them into affordable housing, but also investing in green infrastructure in the neighborhood and developing social enterprises in order to provide jobs for local residents to build rain gardens, bioswales, green stormwater infrastructure, weatherization, and things like that. On the east side of town in the Fruit Belt, the Fruit Belt Community Land Trust has been working to be able to acquire land that the city has. The Fruit Belt is a historically middle-class neighborhood that faced a lot of disinvestment, a very racially diverse neighborhood that now has about 200 vacant and underinvested in properties that the city has taken ownership of, and now the land trust is in the process of acquiring those properties from the city and putting them into a land trust so that it can be community owned and developed and not at risk of having outside folks come in and buy the properties or speculators come in and raise property prices. And this is really important in that community. The photo here shows in the background a major hospital investment and expansion that's happening right on the edge of the neighborhood. So there are a lot of concerns about how that might increase property values in this neighborhood that's right adjacent to that investment. So finally, to wrap up on where to start for urban water practitioners and advocates, just a couple of final thoughts here. First is, most importantly, to start now. If you haven't already, Robin and Paulina showed a great example of how they've already started to think about displacement and get active on housing issues in their community. But I just can't emphasize enough the importance of starting as soon as possible before projects start, before changes start to happen in the community, because it is so much easier to put protections in place in advance than to try to put them in afterwards. And I think Buffalo is a good example of that, where a lot of the city leadership in the city would argue that they don't have a displacement problem, they have an underinvestment problem, they have issues with vacancy rates and things like that. But the community organizers have been able to get in before a lot of speculation has taken place and able to actually buy up and control a lot of land, and that's incredibly important. The second thing here is just to partner with housing and tenant organizations active in your community. If you haven't yet, reach out, get to know them, get to know what they're working on, and break down silos. So not only know what they're working on, but how have you joined a housing justice coalition? Are there housing organizations that are on your board that are helping you to coordinate your strategies of green infrastructure projects with and connect that with their campaigns around housing? And then finally, to be explicit about racial equity in all the work that you do. And a real simple way that I suggest to folks is just to ask these 3 questions in everything that you do. Just ask who benefits, who pays, and who decides. And to use that to kind of guide who's being left behind and who's able to benefit, and really who is being centered in the policymaking and in the projects that you're working on. So with that, I will turn it back to Deanna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. We're going to transition to Tony here in a minute. And as we transition, there were a couple of questions. One of them was, when you discuss urban renewal is that a certain set of formal policies or a more generic term?
That's a good question. So there is certainly an official urban renewal program and federal funding that went into that. But there's also ways that that shows up, such as redevelopment, that is oftentimes more led by local jurisdictions today. So I would say urban renewal is, yes, that can reference a specific federal program that is no longer active in most cities, but you can also think of current ways in which cities or counties or federal jurisdictions are using their eminent domain powers in order to remove communities. An example of that that's more recent, it started in the early 2000s, is in East Baltimore, a major expansion of the Johns Hopkins, this kind of mixed-use development project that's been happening for the last decade or so. That it's not an official kind of a federal urban renewal project in that technical sense of the term, but has a lot of the same characteristics of using eminent domain powers to take people's homes, remove them, demolish the homes, and rebuild new housing and new facilities in the community.
Thank you. There is another question. This one has a little bit of background information. I live in a small rural city in the Hudson Valley of New York State. We are experiencing serious displacement from people moving up from Brooklyn. The 30% guideline for housing costs doesn't seem to work for us because the costs of transportation to work, which is often non-existent via transit. So the H&T index is more like 45% of income. I'm assuming H&T is housing and transit. When do you use or recommend that others use the H&T rate and not just the cost of housing?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I'm so glad that there's somebody from the Hudson Valley here, because that is an area that we've just started doing a little bit of work in around New York State, looking at anti-displacement and the way that displacement doesn't look the same in every community. And so absolutely, while we can talk about housing costs, transportation costs, and I don't think this is unique just to Hudson Valley, but in a lot of our metro regions, as folks have been displaced or moving out of the urban core to suburbs or exurbs and are spending not only an increasing amount of money to commute back for their jobs, but also a lot of time. 2-hour commutes each way is becoming common in the Bay Area for working class folks who've moved out to Stockton in the Central Valley. So absolutely, I think that that's a really important thing to consider as well, of looking at transportation costs in addition to housing costs. I don't think that our cost burden data comes from a national data set on our National Equity Atlas. We also have transportation, car ownership and commute time data on there as well, but we have not taken the step to really integrate those into a dynamic metric that can be used to give a more holistic view of housing cost burden. I know that there's resources out there of folks who have done that. So I would absolutely say that if your community has the data resources to do that, to include transportation costs as a part of the calculation of housing cost burden.
Great. All right, let me go ahead and move us back to Tony's presentation. There's a number of questions that are still waiting to be answered, but let's come back to those at the end of Tony's presentation. So thank you so much, Chris. I do want to say you referenced a report that's coming out, that you guys are coming out with shortly from the cohort of groups that you're working with, or communities, and we'll be sure to share that via the Urban Waters Learning Network website. So please keep an eye out for that. We're trying to keep as many resources uploaded, recent resources related to this topic, as we can get our hands on. So let's come back around to additional questions, but in the interest of time, let me make sure that we get through hearing from Tony from Verde, who is a super exciting effort to start to think about more broadly when we think about conservation and park access, et cetera, also thinking about other strategies to address some of these pressures of anti-displacement and gentrification. And so this Living Cully is an excellent example of groups that are doing exactly that in Portland, Oregon. So with that, Tony, do you want to take it away? Your slides are up and you can just guide me to proceed slide by slide.
Gracias, Diana. Good morning, everyone from Portland. It's an honor and privilege to be with you all today. My name is Tony Defalco. I work at Verde, and thank you, Renee and Deanna and others for creating the opportunity for us to share a little bit about the work that we're doing here in Portland with you all. And I have to say, I'm super excited by the strong turnout on this call and having learned a little bit more about the Urban Waters Network, and of course having long history with River Network. You know, it's to me, having worked in this field for 20 years and over the course of that time, you know, not seeing social justice centered in environmental protection efforts, I'm greatly heartened by the fact that there are 70 folks on this call, and I think the dialogue is changing fairly rapidly toward one where environmental protection, without it being centered in social justice or economic justice, is simply no longer an acceptable pathway. And so I just share that real excitement and enthusiasm with you. So with that, I want to tell you a little bit about Verde and about one of our efforts here. And so Verde serves communities by building environmental wealth through social enterprise, outreach, and advocacy. And we've been doing that for 15 years here in Portland. And this connection relative to gentrification has become much more exacerbated as of late. In 2015, Governing Magazine, through its study of gentrification nationally, noted that Portland was the fastest gentrifying city in the country. And so our efforts since 2003 have constantly evolved from one of producing environmental and economic benefits through stormwater landscape and tree plantings in our Verde landscape program, which I'll talk more about, to much more focus on grassroots outreach and community organizing, and increasingly to policy work. So I'll talk a little bit about that pathway here in the short time we have. If you can go to the next slide, please, Deanna. So as I noted, we work in 3 areas: social enterprise, outreach, and advocacy. And our original program that started in our original social enterprise that started in 2005 is called Verde Landscape. It's a workforce training program. It's 15 years in operation. We currently have around 1.3 million in revenues. And we provide higher than average industry wages, 80 hours of paid training per year, and full health, dental, and dependent care for trainees and employees of the enterprise. Currently, we have around 12 folks in the enterprise. And the scopes, as you can see, are stormwater facility installation and maintenance, tree planting, habitat restoration, and increasingly working in trying to find higher scopes of work in stormwater and water infrastructure space. The social enterprise is really important because what we found in Portland was that while there was a high emphasis on increasing our green infrastructure relative to stormwater, there was very little emphasis on extending those economic benefits to low-income and people of color communities. So for us, we see this as a really strong anti-displacement measure where in addition to creating the environmental benefits of green infrastructure to address stormwater, you can simultaneously address economic justice and put more money into the hands of local low-income people and people of color through training programs like Verde Landscape. Next slide, please. The second social enterprise we operate is called Verde Builds, and this is a general contractor. And the goal is to increase minority and women-owned business and social enterprise contracting in the green infrastructure sector. So far, we've completed a few projects, a 78 kilowatt solar installation and a 25-acre park, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And in the pipeline, we have 300 kilowatt solar installation and EV charging stations, among other projects. And I highlight this enterprise in the context of displacement because in Portland, we've seen very, very little participation of minority, women, and social enterprise businesses in the green infrastructure sector. And so part of our effort over the last 15 years has been to work to increase the institutional desire to include in their RFPs more than just low bid outcomes and to include social equity outcomes. And we've had fairly modest success with that, but I think we've been able to be part of a broader effort of minority and women contracting community to really call for and demand and increased opportunities for minority and women-owned businesses and social enterprise in this sector. And in the last 5 years, we've really turned that to focusing more on doing it ourselves by creating this social enterprise that basically can subcontract to minority and women-owned businesses and other social enterprises to perform all manner of green infrastructure, whether that's solar installation, EV charging stations, green roofs, bike lanes, green street installations. We have built all those kinds of investments, and we're able to now general contract and work with other businesses that may or may not have experience installing those, but we can certainly help them build those infrastructure investments and get a leg up on the next one that would be built. So next slide, please. So I want to ground us a little bit in the Cully neighborhood in Northeast Portland. It's one of the larger neighborhoods in Portland. It's located in the northeast of Portland. It's near the airport. It's about 3.3 square miles in size. Pretty low density, around 13,000 people in the neighborhood. Predominantly low income and people of color neighborhood, although it is experiencing rapid gentrification. And this is where Verde got its start. We've been housed here for the last 15 years. And over the course of that time, we've worked together with other important institutions in the neighborhood that serve low-income people and people of color, like Hacienda Community Development Corporation, the Native American Youth and Family Center, and Habitat for Humanity, among others. We also work very closely with many of the churches and schools in the neighborhood. And what you see on the screen there are a couple examples of the challenges the community faces. On the left, you see folks walking on a fairly typical street in the neighborhood, no sidewalks, very little shoulder. Only 24% of the streets in the neighborhood have sidewalks. There's very little connectivity. This is the only neighborhood that doesn't have a bus service that runs to downtown. And so on the right there is one of the 6 mobile home parks in the neighborhood where some of the most vulnerable members of our community live. And so our effort over the last 10 years has been to take a more intentional and collaborative approach to addressing housing, green infrastructure and sustainability, transportation, and economic opportunity. And we've encapsulated that in something that we call Living Cully. Next slide, please. So Living Cully is this now 10-year-old collaborative effort of the 4 institutions I mentioned before. Hacienda and Habitat are housing providers, but also provide social enterprises and economic opportunities for their clients. The Native American Youth and Family Center provides wraparound services for the 40,000 Native folks that live in Portland metro area. They work on everything from housing to economic development to operating a high school at their facility in the neighborhood for at-risk youth. And of course, Verde with our social enterprises and grassroots organizing. And what I would want to share are a couple points here. One is I really appreciated Chris's point earlier about the need to act early and often relative to housing in particular. And so all of the environmental investments that we have made in the neighborhood, including the park, which I'll talk about next, have come only in tandem with the acquisition of land for affordable housing. And so you can see we purchased 5.5 acres of land and have 240 affordable homes in production. We protected 2 of the mobile home parks from eviction, and we've created the city's first mobile home park zoning designation to protect additional parks in the neighborhood and throughout the city. And so that's a lot of housing activity for arguably what is an environmental organization. And I would just encourage all of you on the phone to find partners who can work alongside you and you work alongside them with this really critical issue, because too often we see critical environmental investments come into places like Coley only to see the folks, the low income and people of color folks that live there get forced out as those investments raise property values, increase the desirability of a community to be lived in. And our approach has been to be very aggressive about pairing our environmental protection agenda with a housing agenda that is both sticks and bricks in terms of acquiring and protecting land, and also mobilizing and using policy to further protect most vulnerable populations in terms of gentrification and displacement from being moved out of neighborhoods like Coley. And I think that, you know, like I said, we've had some modest success doing that. I'd say we're kind of holding the line now in a place where gentrification is rapid. I don't think we've reached the point yet where we're able to say we're above the line in terms of being able to have enough housing to meet the needs of low-income people in the neighborhood. And we're seeing that constant process of people having to move out because of cost. But we have several things in the works, and I want to share one of them with you. So next slide, please. So Koli Park was a 25-acre landfill located in the neighborhood. It was a commercial waste landfill. It was located directly adjacent to low-income and people of color's homes. It was operated until around 1990, and it was poorly operated. There were methane was leaking from the site and into the basements of people's homes nearby. So again, I really appreciated Chris talk about power. This represented the lack of power in a community to resist a landfill being placed in their community. So when the landfill closed and the methane was begun to be captured properly, the community wanted to see a park developed there. This is one of the most park deficient neighborhoods in the city. And when we got involved in 2005, basically we understood that not only was there a need for an environmental asset in the community, but there was also a need for economic opportunity in the community. We did a survey of community members prior to engaging in building the park, and we understood from the community members that there was a desire to have economic opportunity relative to the project. So just a little bit about the project itself. It is complete. It opened on June 30th, 2018. We had 76% minority and women-owned contractor engagement on the project. You can see some of the trees and shrubs planted and the acreage that was restored, and the new access to the number of households, the majority of whom are low income. And I just want to go back again and say at that same time that we opened that park, we collectively with our Living Cully collaboration purchased land for affordable housing, built new affordable housing, created policies and practices with the city to protect the mobile home parks in the neighborhood. So I just can't emphasize that enough, that at the same time we bring environmental investments, we have been focused on bringing practices and policies to protect low-income homeowners and renters from being displaced. And the last slide, please. So a couple of, I don't have the websites on there. The websites are verdenw.org, livingcully.org, and verdelandscape.org. And I just want to note real quickly for a couple of last points is first that there really is an opportunity to create these multiple benefits in environmental sustainability activities, and we're happy to share more about that. Two is it really helps to have a game plan. And one of the things we did early on was to commission a study around what does it look like to have a set of anti-displacement policies to guide our activities. And in 2013, we completed a report called Not in Coley, Anti-Displacement Strategies for the Cully Neighborhood. And that really has become a roadmap for us and a helpful template for the city as it has considered anti-displacement policies in its comprehensive plan updates, which we've achieved many good policies in our comprehensive plan. Some of the policies around protecting renters and homeowners, and then some of the outstanding issues that we know we still need to address, like the cost of childcare and good access to transit in the community. So I just, again, want to thank you all for your interest and thank Deanna and Renee for the opportunity, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Tony. I want to make sure folks start, there's a bunch of questions. If you could start lining those up, Renee, I do have everybody's contact information here, so you can, we can hit, hopefully you're seeing that being projected. So yeah, you can get in touch with any of our speakers. So I do want to just really thank our speakers. You all are doing amazing work in this area. We are super excited to bring this discussion to the Urban Waters Learning Network. So as Renee kind of starts pulling up those questions, I hope that today's session really lays a foundation for us to understand some of the triggers, some of the drivers around gentrification, and start to provide a model for what urban waters work might look like going forward. I think the Living Cully Coalition is an excellent example of how, as we're doing urban waters work, we can also, rather than watch what follows, which is what a lot of us have been in the unfortunate position of doing, seeing the displacement follow after the water work has gone into place, to really think about those two pieces in tandem. So our next webinars on this topic are going to dig deeper into how we can use data to both track neighborhood change and identify areas vulnerable to gentrification and displacement. And then future sessions will dig deeper into strategies around housing, strategies around workforce development, so that we can really think about the kind of coalitions and partnerships we can enter into, such as Living Cully, to really help us get ahead of this, if that's possible, as we're doing work around revitalizing waterways. So with that, Renee, you want to pick up a couple of the questions, and I just encourage everybody to keep adding them to the question box, and we'll just get to as many as we can.
Sure thing. And I also wanted to note that I put links for Verde and Living Cully in the chat box as well for everybody to access those. Chris started answering some of these in the questions box, but I think that it's good to have them in the discussion as well. So there was one question about community land trusts as a strategy to address gentrification and displacement. And I know that you talked about it a little bit during the presentation, Chris, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. And there's been, I think, a lot of growing momentum behind the notion of community land trusts. So community land trusts have been around for a long time, really come out of African American farmer organizing in the rural South as a way to gain some amount of self-determination in the land, but has since migrated to cities and communities around the country. Perhaps the biggest ones is in Burlington, Vermont, and they've been very effective at getting a large number of properties and being able to put them into a land trust. So absolutely, we think that they're an incredibly important community ownership and stabilizing model for displacement. I'll say some of the things about a community land trust that makes them more effective than other forms of affordable housing development and preservation. It has to do with the ownership structure of having this mission-driven nonprofit own the underlying land, which is what the land trust model is, and then having the individual buildings, whether they're multifamily or single family, be owned by the residents themselves. And what that does is it ensures affordability. It ensures that as the buildings get sold or as tenants move out, that the organization can ensure a long-term affordability of the units. And that's incredibly important because a lot of the other models that we have for affordable housing development, unfortunately, have time limitations on them. So if you're looking at low-income housing tax credit projects or inclusionary zoning or other types of funding sources, oftentimes there's a time limit on that. So with low-income housing tax credits, we're actually coming up now on some of the earlier units that were funded facing expiration in the coming years. And so now we have to identify more resources just to be able to keep those units affordable. Whereas community land trusts are what we would call permanently affordable housing. There are challenges, one of the biggest being financing. Because of that permanent affordability, it can be really hard to find resources that are willing, that can be locked up for an indeterminate amount of time. But I think we've seen some great examples. Actually, I wish I knew the date, but we can send it around in the follow-up email. PolicyLink is going to be hosting a webinar sometime in June that is specifically talking about land trusts, and they'll be looking at models in Oakland and in Houston. And in Houston, they've actually started to dedicate some of their general fund and housing trust fund dollars towards community land trusts in a major way in recognition of that being a more permanent source of affordable housing and a better affordable housing strategy than investing in units that could expire in 30, 40 years. So the short answer to the question is yes, absolutely. Community land trust should be a part of the displacement and anti-displacement strategy. I'd say they can't be, in most cities, it can't be the only strategy just because they do take a while to acquire and there's and the upfront costs, so including protection policies, like what Tony was describing with the mobile home park or rent control or just cause eviction or those sorts of protections of existing residents are also absolutely essential.
Well, let me jump in with a couple of questions that came in for Tony. Thanks for that, Chris. Tony, you need to unmute yourself too, but how was the Koli Park funded and a couple of others? How did you conduct the community survey? How was participation engaged? And what types of partnerships were in place as we're pursuing the funding for some of these projects?
Sure, great question. So the park was funded from 45 different sources of funding. We raised $14 million over a 6-year period. And about half of that came from the city of Portland. The city of Portland owns the park and operates the park. And about half of that came from a variety of local, foundation, state funding, and a little tiny bit of federal funding from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And so I'm happy to share out a list of the different sources with anyone that's interested. The community engagement was very broad and deep and reflected the fact that we've been embedded in this community for a long time. And so, for example, community members prior to the park's development we had 15 people with stipends that spent 9 months learning about brownfields and brownfield redevelopment, and really guiding the state agencies in developing the soil and air assessment process. And that was the first time that had been done like that in the state of Oregon, and we received an award for that process. And that that required a lot of work. We had multilingual translation at every meeting, childcare at every meeting. Like I said, stipends for the community members. And one of the things that I think was representative of that continued through the process was, we asked community members not just to come and give us their input on the park or the design, but really to have a meaningful role. And so that meaningful role of learning about and being a kind of a community ambassador for the park and telling folks that the park was safe to build on because they knew the process for testing the site and they were part of it, and they actually went out during the testing and observed, all the way through to youth designing the playground, to the Native community designing the city's first Native gathering garden. It really represented a very deep and wide engagement process.
Thanks, Tony. There's another question, and maybe both of you would have tips. I am involved in a citywide green infrastructure master planning process where I am advocating for integrating affordable housing protections. Do you have any tips for this kind of effort?
I'm happy to start, yes. So we've been pretty vocal in the city of Portland and the regional government here, Metro. And for many years there was kind of this siloing effect where the environmental wasn't incorporating housing and other social justice components. And so our approach has been to work to integrate those in our process here in the city of Portland, which is somewhat unique. We have cities are required to promulgate a comprehensive land use plan I believe it's every 10 or 20 years. I can't remember now. But our focus on that was to advocate through a coalition of around 33 organizations, a series of policy recommendations to be included in the comprehensive land use update that specified environmental, social, and economic benefits for low-income and people of color communities as part of the plan's ongoing implementation. And we were fairly successful in that, and I'm happy to share some of the policies if you'd like to see them. But I would say that the key really was to have that coalition, and 33 groups in Portland is a lot, and having 20, 30, 50 people go down to City Hall during the process of developing the plan and during the Planning and Sustainability Commission's meetings and during the council work session and adoption was absolutely essential to ensuring that those very equitable policies were incorporated into the plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with what Tony said, and absolutely, first, you're on the right track for wanting to advocate for affordable housing within the citywide green infrastructure plan. So that's, getting that recognition of the connection of these issues is a great first step. And then working in coalition with organizations that do housing justice work is always a great step to understand what are the specific challenges. So I'll also highlight something that Tony mentioned in his presentation, which was the Living Cully's Not in Coley report and the recommendations that they came up with there, which if you look at them are very specific to kind of what are the needs in that neighborhood through the organizing work that they've been doing. But having those sorts of recommendations, like that they put together could absolutely show up in a green infrastructure report. And I would just say, including that question of timing. So one of the challenges that we see in anti-displacement work is, for example, here in the Bay Area on housing, people will oftentimes talk about the 3 Ps: protection, preservation, production, which are all necessary for addressing housing challenges. But then it's important that they all move forward together, and that doesn't always happen without directly linking the policies, tying them together to say, okay, if we're going to do upzoning in a neighborhood, we're first going to make sure that those tenant protections are in place, or as Paulina and Robin were describing in their case in Seattle, of having a opportunity to purchase for local neighborhood organizations or for tenants if there's going to be an increase in investor activity in the neighborhood. And there's a great policy that just got passed in San Francisco earlier this month that does exactly that. That gives the community an opportunity to purchase buildings once they go out on the market. Now you need to have funding behind that, so there's challenges in implementing a policy like that. But those sorts of having those sorts of policies and directly linking them to as investments come into a neighborhood are really important.
Great. One other question: what is meant by protecting mobile home parks from eviction? Does that mean some protection so that the families cannot be evicted, or is it that the whole park cannot be sold, or is it something else?
Great question. So in Oregon, state law requires a 1-year notification to residents of a sale of a park. Oftentimes, that notification is done in a way that doesn't really give the community much time to respond, because even though it's a year notification, the community has to respond within 2 weeks of receiving the notice. And so usually what happens when a park is noticed and is then subsequently sold, the residents are evicted. So our effort over the last 5 years has been to do community organizing in the parks. And so we started with just really going to the parks. Around 10% of the people in the community live in the mobile home parks in the neighborhood. And we really just started by going and asking people what was going on in the parks, what kinds of issues were they facing. And one of the biggest things we heard was the need for repairs. And so we started a mobile home repair program that was an organizing practice. It wasn't simply us coming in and repairing many of the problems, whether it was a hole in the roof or mold or lack of an ADA access to the home. But we said, we'll bring some of the supplies and perhaps, a journey carpenter, but members of the community are going to come together and start to repair each other's homes. And so that really sort of snowballed into this powerful community organizing practice called the Coley Housing Action Team, or CHAT. And because people started repairing each other's homes and getting to know each other better. And then when they were organized in that way, when that park was noticed for sale, they were immediately able to say, hey, we don't want to be evicted. We want to continue to live here in close-in Portland. We can't afford to live anywhere else. And so we were able to come together and purchase the park, and then subsequently purchase a second park in a similar fashion. And now those 2 parks are permanently protected as affordable housing. And in one of the parks, after the new ownership took place, the rents actually went down. And so I just highlight all that as a short way of saying that eviction means, usually when a park is sold, it's developed as higher value housing, and those residents get evicted.
All right, well, I think that brings us to the end of our questions. I want to thank our speakers again. Paulina, Robin, it's great to hear that you're entering this work in the Duwamish Basin. And Chris and Tony, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your experience with this work. We are following up. Tomorrow you will all receive an email that has a link to the recording to today's session, and it'll include some links to some of the reports that Chris referenced. Tony, there's interest in also getting a hold of the policies that you referenced. So if those are online, I can also include those links and send them to me so that everybody has access to them. So with that, let me turn it to Renee to highlight some of the upcoming trainings we have on this topic and a couple of others. Renee?
Thank you. And I just want to say thanks to all the presenters and the people that have attended this webinar as well. we have more opportunities for you in the coming months. So the next webinar in this series will be on June 5th, and you will get a link to register for that one after today's session. We are also, the Urban Waters Learning Network is launching a series on community resilience. So that first webinar in that series will be on June 12th, and it has to do with climate education. And the network, as well as River Network, is offering webinars pertaining to drinking water with 2 dates available in June. All of these webinars are free. We also have a lot more resources that we've been putting together on gentrification and displacement on the website. I've written several blog posts, including one that highlights Tony's work and the work of Living Cully. There are a number of reports related to equitable development metrics, policies, and other topics. So if you go to the urbanwaterslearningnetwork.org, there's a resources toolbox, and you just need to check equitable development to get all of those resources.
All right, thank you. Yeah, and on the drinking water theme, we have just released a drinking water guide, which is, we anticipate going to soon become a Bible for community advocates around the issue of drinking water. So this first session on June 4th will be an introduction to that, and there'll be other sessions following. So with that, thank you. Another thing we'll link to that email, excuse me, is an evaluation survey. Please, please, please take 2 minutes to fill it out so we can improve on these webinars. And want to encourage everybody to consider coming to River Rally in Cleveland in June. Today is the last day for early bird rates. And on Friday, the 21st, we'll be hosting the Urban Waters Learning Network Forum, which is where a lot of these conversations have been coming up over the years. So we hope that through this webinar series, we can enter into those discussions this year with a little bit more of a foundation about what the work looks like or could look like on the ground to prevent displacement. So encourage you to take a look at that. You can just go to rivernetwork.org. You'll find a link to register. So again, thank you all. Thank you, our presenters. We had a very engaged audience and lots of questions coming in. So please keep them coming. If you're interested in learning more about the Urban Waters Learning Network, this is who we are. We are co-sponsored by Groundwork USA and River Network. And you can reach myself at that email or my counterpart, Maria Brodeen at Groundwork USA at that email address. So if you want to get involved, get engaged with other learning network activities, just give us a shout. So thank you all. Have a great afternoon, and keep an eye out for ongoing resources on this topic. We're just getting started. Have a great day, everybody.